The first fist hit Elena Vogel's door at 2 in the morning, then another, then pounding, desperate animal pounding from the same man who'd stood in the general store 3 months ago and told everyone she was building her own coffin. Now Thomas Ridley was screaming her name into a blizzard that had already killed his roof, scattered his firewood, and left his wife and 2 children shaking in nothing but nightclothes. Elena opened that door. She looked at the man who had made her life a misery, and she stepped aside to let him in. If you're watching this, subscribe to the channel. Follow this story all the way to the end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. The land deed was still damp with her husband's blood when Elena Vogel folded it into her coat and walked out of the doctor's house in Pueblo. Carl Vogel had died the way too many men died that winter of 1855, coughing, freezing, curled on a cot inside a cabin that couldn't hold heat, no matter how much wood they burned. The walls had gaps. The roof leaked wind. The fireplace drew wrong and half the smoke stayed inside. Carl knew it. He'd known it for weeks before the fever took his lungs. "Don't build like I did," he told her. His hand was so thin she could feel every bone when he gripped her wrist. "Promise me." Carl. "Promise me, Elena. Not wood. Not like this. Something smarter. Something the cold can't get into." She promised. She didn't understand what he meant yet, but she promised. 3 weeks later, she understood everything. Elena sold what was left. The broken cabin, the mule that was half lame, 2 chairs Carl had built the first summer. She kept the deed. 160 acres in a valley northwest of Pueblo, up where the mountains started getting serious. Nobody wanted it. The land office clerk had laughed when Carl filed on it. "That's sheep country," the clerk said. And bad sheep country at that. But Carl had seen something. A south-facing slope protected from the north wind by a ridge of granite. A creek that ran year-round. And soil, deep, dense, clay-heavy soil that held together when you cut into it. Elena arrived in the valley in April of 1856. She came on foot the last 7 miles because the wagon road ended at Harlan's Creek and nobody had bothered to cut a trail beyond it. She carried what she could. Tools, seed, a canvas bag of dried beans, a book on root cellars she'd found in a shop in Pueblo, written by a German farmer who'd homesteaded in Minnesota. The valley already had people. Maybe 40 souls spread across a dozen claims. They'd been there 2-3 years. Long enough to have opinions. Long enough to believe they knew how things worked. Margaret Sutter was the first to speak to her. Margaret was 52, built like a fence post, and had buried her own husband the year before. She found Elena kneeling at the base of the south slope, driving a stick into the ground every 3 feet in a straight line. "You, Elena Vogel." "I am. Heard about Carl. I'm sorry." "Thank you." Margaret watched her drive another stick. "What are you marking?" "Where I'm going to dig." "Dig what?" "My house." Margaret didn't laugh. She didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she sat down on a rock and folded her arms. "You're going to dig a house, into the hill." "That's right. You know people are going to think you've lost your mind." Elena pulled the stick out, repositioned it 6 inches to the left, and drove it back in. People can think what they want. That was the first conversation. It was also the last kind one Elena would have for a long time. Word moved through the valley the way it always did, fast, distorted, and cruel. By the end of the first week, everyone knew about the widow who was digging into the hillside. The story got bigger every time someone told it. She's digging a cave. She's digging a grave. She thinks she's a badger. Thomas Ridley was the loudest. Ridley had the biggest claim in the valley, 180 acres. He ran cattle on, and he'd built what he considered the finest cabin between Pueblo and the mining camps. Plank walls, shingled roof, a stone fireplace he'd hauled rock for all summer. He was proud of that cabin. He was proud of everything he did, and he needed other people to be less so he could feel it properly. He brought it up at Harlan's store on a Saturday when half the valley was there buying flour and gossip. Any of you seen what that Vogel woman is doing up on the south slope? Laughter already, just from his tone. She's digging herself a burrow, like a ground squirrel. He leaned on the counter. Her husband dies in a cabin, so she decides cabins are the problem. That's female logic for you. More laughter, even from some of the women. Harlan, who owned the store, shook his head. That hillside's solid clay. She'll be digging till she's 70. She won't make it to winter, Ridley said. Mark my words. She'll come crawling down here begging somebody to take her in before the first snow flies. Elena heard about it. Of course she heard about it. Margaret told her straight and unvarnished because Margaret believed a person deserved to know what was being said behind her back. Elena's hands were raw. She'd broken the handle on her only pickaxe the day before and had to wrap it with wet leather to hold it together. She'd been digging for 9 days, and she'd moved maybe 4 feet into the slope. Ridley says I'll come crawling, Elena said. That's what he says. Elena looked at her hands. She looked at the shallow cut in the hillside that would take months to become anything. She looked at Margaret. He's wrong. That was all she said. She picked up the pickaxe and went back to work. By June, Elena had carved 8 feet into the slope. The work was brutal. She swung the pick until her shoulders locked up, then she shoveled the loose dirt into a wheelbarrow and hauled it out. She worked from first light until she couldn't see. She ate standing up. She slept in a canvas lean-to propped against the hill face. But something was happening that she hadn't expected. The deeper she dug, the cooler the air became. Not cold-cool. Even on the hottest days in June when the valley shimmered and people's cabins turned into ovens, the air inside Elena's cut stayed comfortable. She put her hand against the back wall and felt its steady, even temperature. The earth wasn't just blocking the heat, it was holding its own climate. She started reading Carl's notes again. He'd scribbled them in the margins of a feed catalog, half in German, half in English. Drawings of arched ceilings, notes about drainage angles, a sketch of a ventilation shaft he'd seen in a picture of an old European wine cellar. Carl hadn't been rambling. He'd been designing. Elena changed her approach. She stopped digging straight and started shaping. She curved the ceiling into an arch, not because it looked nice, but because Carl's notes said an arch distributed weight. She angled the floor slightly toward the entrance, so water would run out, not pool. She left a column of earth in the center for support, then realized she didn't need it and cut it away because the clay was holding itself. Margaret came up every few days. She never offered to help. She just watched, asked questions. How do you keep the walls from collapsing? The clay holds itself once it dries, and the arch pushes the weight to the sides, not straight down. What about water? Rain gets into everything. I'm cutting a trench above the entrance. Water follows the path you give it. If I send it around, it goes around. Margaret chewed on that. Carl teach you this. Carl started it. I'm finishing it. In July, something changed. A man named Dawson, quiet, kept to himself, ran a small outfit on the east side of the valley, showed up at Elena's site one morning. He didn't say much. He watched her work for about 20 minutes. Then he spoke. That arch, how deep does it go? 12 feet now. And the temperature inside? Cool in the heat. I think it'll be warm when it gets cold. Dawson nodded slowly. My cabin gets so cold in winter I can see my breath from the bed. Last February I woke up and the water bucket by the door had frozen solid. Inside the cabin. Elena stopped digging. She looked at him. How thick are your walls? 6 inches. Good pine. Wood breathes, Mr. Dawson. It lets air through. Every gap, every knot, every crack between logs, that's the cold getting in. Earth doesn't breathe. Earth holds. Dawson stared at the opening in the hillside. He stared for a long time. People say you're crazy. People say a lot of things. I don't think you're crazy. He left. He didn't come back for weeks. But Elena noticed something. Dawson stopped laughing with Ridley at the store. He stopped laughing at all, actually. He just went quiet, the way a man goes quiet when he's rethinking everything he thought he knew. August brought heat that cracked the ground. 3 wells in the valley went low. Ridley's cattle started dying 2, then 4, then 6 in a week. He blamed the drought. He blamed the land. He blamed everything except his own planning. Elena's creek kept running. The spring that fed it came from deep underground, and the hillside shaded it from the worst of the sun. She started storing water clay jugs she made herself lined up inside the dugout where the temperature kept them cool. Margaret saw the jugs and said nothing for a full minute. "You're storing water underground where it stays cold." "Yes." "While the rest of us are watching our wells dry up." "Your wells aren't deep enough. They tap the surface water. My spring taps the rock water. Different source." Margaret looked at Elena the way you look at someone when you realize they're not who you thought they were. Not crazy. Not stubborn. Something else entirely. Something that made Margaret uncomfortable because it suggested that maybe, just maybe, the way they'd all been doing things wasn't the only way. Wasn't even the best way. "Elena," Margaret said carefully, "have you tried telling anyone this? About the water, the temperature? Who would listen?" Margaret opened her mouth. Closed it. Because she knew the answer. Nobody. Nobody would listen. Not because Elena was wrong, but because she was a woman, she was a widow, she was new, and she was different. 4 strikes. In a valley like this one was enough. September came. Elena's dugout was 20 feet deep, 10 feet wide, and 7 feet tall at the crown of the arch. She'd framed the entrance with timber, the only wood in the entire structure, and hung a door she'd built from salvaged planks. She'd cut a ventilation shaft through the top of the hill, angled so rain couldn't get in, but air could move. She'd lined the floor with flat stones from the creek fitted tight so they drained clean. It wasn't a cave. It wasn't a hole. It was a house. A real house built into the body of the earth itself, and it worked in ways that no cabin in the valley could match. Elena knew this because she tested it. She put a candle inside and closed the door and waited. The flame held perfectly steady. No draft. No flicker. The air moved through the ventilation shaft, slowly, gently cycling, without creating wind. She put a pan of water on the floor and came back 12 hours later. The temperature hadn't changed enough to form condensation. She put her hand against the back wall. Cool in September. It would be warm in December. She knew it the way she knew her own name because the earth didn't lie. The earth was physics, and physics didn't care what Thomas Ridley thought. The first frost came on October 9th. Elena was ready. She'd spent the last 3 weeks of September building a small clay fireplace into the back wall of the dugout. Not a big one. She didn't need big. The whole point was that the earth held heat. A small fire would raise the interior temperature, and the walls would absorb it, store it, radiate it back slowly. She calculated she'd need maybe a quarter of the firewood a normal cabin required, maybe less. She'd also built shelving into the walls, carved right into the clay, then hardened with low heat from a torch. She stored dried meat beans, cornmeal, jarred vegetables. She stored more than she needed for herself, though she didn't tell anyone why. Maybe she knew. Maybe she sensed it the way animals sense a bad season coming. Something in the air. Something in the way the geese left 3 weeks earlier than usual. Something in the weight of the sky. Or maybe she was just careful. Maybe Carl's death had taught her that careful was the difference between living and dying, and she would never stop being careful again. The rest of the valley prepared the way they always did. Firewood stacked against cabin walls. Root cellars dug shallow and lined with straw. Windows stuffed with rags. The same way their parents had done it. The same way that had killed Carl Vogel and hundreds like him. Ridley, of course, was the most confident. He stood outside his cabin in mid-October, sleeves rolled up like the cold was beneath him, and announced to anyone within earshot that this winter would be like every other winter. Freeze a little. Burn a lot of wood. Come out the other side. That's how it works. Dawson was there. He said nothing, but his eyes drifted up toward the south slope, where a thin line of smoke rose from Elena's ventilation shaft, barely visible, like a thread against the gray sky. He thought about the water bucket that had frozen inside his cabin last February. He thought about Elena's hand against that cool, steady wall. He thought about a lot of things, but he didn't say any of them. Not yet. Not until it was almost too late. November was cold. December was colder. But the real winter, the winter that would break everything, hadn't started yet. It was waiting, and it was patient. The first week of January 1857 came in quiet, and that was the part that fooled everyone. Cold, yes, bitter cold, the kind that turned breath into clouds and made fingers ache inside gloves. But manageable. The valley had seen cold before. Ridley kept saying it at the store, kept saying it to anyone who'd stand still long enough. This is Colorado. It gets cold. You stack wood, you keep your fire going, and you get through it. He said it like a man reciting scripture. Like repetition made it true. Dawson was in the store that day buying salt. He listened to Ridley talk. He watched the other men nod along Henry Falk, who ran goats on the North Ridge. Samuel Pruitt, who'd come out from Missouri with 3 sons and a wife who never spoke above a whisper. Old George Harlan himself, who owned the store and considered himself the unofficial mayor of a place that didn't have one. Dawson set his salt on the counter. "How much wood you got stacked, Thomas?" Ridley looked at him. "Enough. How much is enough?" "More than I'll need." "You said that last year. And last year you were burning fence rails by March." The store went quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of men thinking, but the tight quiet of men deciding whether they were about to watch a fight. Ridley's jaw tightened. "You got something to say, Dawson?" "I'm saying maybe we should think about what happens if this winter isn't like last year, if it's worse. What, you been reading the almanac, or you been talking to that crazy woman up on the hill?" Dawson didn't answer right away. He picked up his salt. He counted out his coins, and then he said very quietly, "She's not crazy, Thomas." He walked out before Ridley could respond. But the damage was done. Ridley's face went red, then white, and he turned to the other men like a preacher who'd just been contradicted during his own sermon. "She's got him twisted up. That's what she does. She talks in circles about temperature and earth and arches, and men like Dawson, men who should know better, start believing her." Harlan wiped the counter. "To be fair, Thomas, her creek didn't dry up last summer. Everyone else's did. A creek is a creek. It's got nothing to do with living underground like a mole." But something had shafted. Dawson's words had cracked something, and even though no one in that store would admit it, they'd all noticed the same things he had. Elena's water didn't run out. Elena's food stored longer. Elena didn't haul firewood from sunup to sundown the way they did. She carried small bundles, half what they burned, and she seemed fine. More than fine. She seemed comfortable, and that bothered them more than they could say. Because comfort in a place like this was supposed to be earned through suffering. You suffered the cold. You suffered the labor. You suffered the wood splitting and the draft plugging and the frozen mornings when you had to break ice on the water bucket before you could make coffee. That was the deal. And Elena had somehow rewritten the deal without asking anyone's permission. The second week of January, the sky changed. Elena felt it first. She was inside the dugout reading by candlelight, Carl's notes again, always Carl's notes, when the air pressure dropped. She didn't need a barometer. Her ears told her. The candle flame, which always burned steady in the dugout's still air, bent slightly toward the ventilation shaft. Air was being pulled upward. That meant the pressure outside was falling fast. She closed Carl's notebook. She stood up. She walked to the door and opened it and looked at the sky. Then she closed the door and began moving. She hauled water first. 4 extra trips to the creek, filling every jug, every pot, every container she had. Then firewood, not the large logs she usually burned, but smaller pieces tightly bundled, stacked along the interior wall where they'd stay dry. Then food. She reorganized her shelves, pulling the heaviest items, the cornmeal, the beans, the dried beef to the front, where she could reach them without searching. Margaret found her mid-afternoon, working at a pace that alarmed her. "Elena, what's wrong?" "Storm coming." Margaret looked at the sky. It was gray, but not threatening. "How do you know?" "The air changed. Pressure dropped. The shaft is pulling draft it shouldn't be pulling." "Could be nothing." "Could be, but I'm not going to bet my life on could be." Margaret stood there for a moment. Then she asked the question that would end up saving her life. How much room do you have in there, if someone else needed shelter? Elena stopped. She looked at Margaret. Really looked at her the way you look at someone when you realize they're finally asking the right question. How many are you thinking? Just me, for now. You can fit. Bring what food you have, and blankets. Margaret left. Elena watched her walk down the slope toward her own cabin, a small, drafty, honest little cabin that Margaret had patched and re-chinked every fall for 3 years. A cabin that would not survive what Elena believed was coming. She went back to work. That evening, Dawson appeared. He didn't come to Elena's dugout. He went to the store. Harlan was closing up stacking bags of flour against the back wall. George, I need to talk to you. Make it quick. Martha's got supper waiting. I think we're in for a bad one. Harlan stopped stacking. Based on what? My bones, the sky, the way the elk moved down 2 weeks earlier than they should have, and the widow. Elena Vogel told you this? She didn't tell me anything, but she's been hauling water all day like she's preparing for a siege. That woman doesn't do things without a reason. Harlan leaned on his flour. Dawson, I've lived in this valley 3 years. We get storms. We survive storms. We survive normal storms. What if this one isn't normal? Then we do what we always do. We burn more wood. Dawson wanted to push harder. He could feel the argument sitting in his chest, like something solid, something urgent. But he knew these men. He knew that pushing harder would only make them push back, because that's what men did when they felt their judgment was being questioned. So he nodded. He said goodnight. And he walked home to a cabin he was already starting to hate. That night he lay in bed and listened to the wind. It wasn't howling yet. It was testing. Probing the gaps in his walls, whispering through the cracks under his door, tapping against the window, like something asking to be let in. He pulled his blanket tighter and thought about Elena's dugout. The stillness inside it, the way sound just stopped at the entrance, the way the air sat heavy and warm like a living thing. At 2 a.m, he got up. He packed a bag. Bedroll dried meat, his hunting knife, a tin of matches, and the small leather Bible his mother had given him when he left Ohio. He didn't know why he was packing. He didn't know where he thought he was going. He just knew he couldn't sleep. And when a man couldn't sleep, it usually meant his body understood something his mind hadn't caught up to yet. He sat in his chair by the dead fire and waited for dawn. January 14th broke gray and heavy. The temperature dropped 12 degrees before noon. By mid-afternoon, it had dropped another 10. The wind, which had been whispered all week, began to talk. Then it began to shout. Elena sealed her door with a strip of oiled canvas she'd prepared in November. She checked her ventilation shaft. The cap she'd built a flat stone on a pivot allowed her to close it halfway without losing all airflow. She lit her fire. A small one. Just enough. Inside the dugout, the temperature held steady. The walls absorbed the heat from the fire and radiated it back evenly slowly from every direction. There was no hot side and cold side. There was no draft chasing the warmth up the chimney. The heat stayed because the earth kept it the way the earth keeps everything patiently, completely without waste. At 4 o'clock, someone knocked. Elena opened the door. Margaret stood there with 2 blankets, a sack of potatoes, and a face that was fighting hard not to show fear. It's bad, Margaret said. I know. Come in. Margaret stepped inside and stopped. She'd been in the dugout before, briefly in daylight. But this was different. The door closed behind her, and the world outside simply vanished. No wind, no cold. No sound except the soft crackle of Elena's fire and the faint whisper of air moving through the shaft. Lord in heaven, Margaret breathed. It's warm. It'll stay warm. The earth holds it. Margaret set down her things. Her hands were shaking, but not from cold, from relief. From the sudden, overwhelming understanding that she was safe, and that safety felt nothing like what she'd been told it was supposed to feel like. They sat together by the fire. Elena heated water for coffee. They didn't speak for a while. There was something sacred about the silence, 2 women alone in the belly of a hill while the sky outside tore itself apart. Then Margaret said, "The others don't have this." Elena's cup stopped halfway to her mouth. "Henry Falk's cabin is worse than mine. And the Pruitt Samuels got those boys, but that cabin leaks from every corner. His wife told me she stuffs rags in the walls, and they freeze solid by morning." "I know." "Elena, if this storm is what you think it is." "I know Margaret." They looked at each other. And in that look was a conversation that didn't need words. Elena knew what Margaret was asking. Margaret knew what Elena was calculating. How many could fit? How much food she had? How long they could hold? "I built this for myself," Elena said, "but I stored enough for more." "Why?" Elena set down her cup. She stared at the wall, at the smooth clay surface Carl had envisioned, and she had carved with bleeding hands alone, mocked for 7 months. Because Carl didn't die from cold. He died because nobody around him had anything better to offer. Everybody was in the same bad cabin with the same bad walls, and when things got bad, there was nowhere to go. No one had built something different. I swore that would never happen again. Not around me. Margaret's eyes filled. She wiped them with the back of her hand and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that could match what Elena had just told her. The storm hit full force at sundown. It didn't build gradually. It came down like a hand slamming flat on a table. One moment the wind was strong. The next moment it was something else entirely. A force, a weight, a sound so deep and constant it stopped being sound and became pressure. The kind of pressure that made walls groan and roofs flex, and men grab their children and pull them to the center of the room away from the walls, because the walls felt alive with it. Ridley's cabin took the first hit. Not a collapse, not yet, but a crack. A long, grinding crack that ran along the base of his north wall where the logs met the foundation stones. Wind found the crack instantly. It poured through like water through a broken dam, and the temperature inside his cabin dropped so fast that his youngest daughter, sleeping in the corner, woke up screaming. His wife, Catherine, grabbed the girl. "Tumps the wall." Ridley saw it. He grabbed a blanket and tried to stuff it into the crack, but the wind was too strong. It shoved the blanket back at him. He tried again. Same result. The cold was inside now, and his fire, his big proud fire in his big proud fireplace, was fighting a losing war. "More wood!" he shouted. His son Thomas Jr. was already moving. The boy was 14 strong, built like his father. He hauled logs from the stack by the door and fed them into the fire, but for every degree the fire gained the crack in the wall, stole too. By midnight, the fire was roaring, and the cabin was still freezing. Across the valley, Henry Falk's roof began to bow. He heard it, a slow, agonizing creak that came from everywhere at once. Snow was piling up on top, and his roof hadn't been built for this kind of weight. He'd cut corners. Everyone knew it. He'd used thin poles instead of proper beams, because proper beams meant more work, and Henry Falk didn't believe in more work when less work would do. Less work wasn't doing. He woke his wife. "Get the children dressed." "Dressed? It's the middle of the night." "Get them dressed, Sarah. Now." She heard it in his voice, the thing he wouldn't say. She got the children dressed. The Pruitts were already in trouble. Samuel's cabin, the one with the rag-stuffed walls, had become an icebox. His wife Mary had the 3 boys huddled around the fireplace, wrapped in every blanket they owned, and she was feeding the fire with the legs of their only table, because the firewood pile was already half gone, and the storm showed no sign of stopping. Samuel stood at the door, holding it shut with both hands, because the wind was trying to open it. He was a big man, 200 pounds, and hard from years of labor, and the wind was winning. Every gust shoved the door an inch inward, and he had to throw his weight against it to push it back. "How long can this last?" Mary asked. "I don't know." "Samuel, the boys." "I know." He knew. He knew exactly what she was saying, and exactly what it meant, and exactly how helpless he was to change it. His cabin was failing. His firewood was disappearing. His children were cold and getting colder, and he, Samuel Pruitt, who had dragged his family 1,000 miles from Missouri on a promise of a better life, could not keep them warm. That was the moment it hit him. Not the wind, not the cold. The understanding. The terrible grinding understanding that everything he'd built, every wall, every beam, every nail he'd driven with his own hands wasn't enough. Had never been enough. Had only seemed like enough because the test hadn't come yet. Now it was here. And his walls were nothing. At 2 a.m, Dawson left his cabin. He didn't agonize over it. He didn't debate. He picked up the bag he'd packed the night before, pulled his coat tight, lowered his head against the wind, and walked. He couldn't see. The snow was so thick and the wind was so strong that he navigated by memory and instinct, counting his steps, feeling the slope of the ground under his boots. He fell twice. The second time, he almost didn't get up because the wind was pushing him flat and the snow was already covering him. And for a moment, just a moment, he thought about how easy it would be to stop, to just let the snow have him, to give up. Then he thought about that water bucket, frozen solid inside his cabin. Inside. He got up. He kept walking. It took him 40 minutes to cover a distance he normally walked in 10. When he reached Elena's door, he hit it with his fist. Not a polite knock, not a request. A demand. The demand of a man who had swallowed his pride and his stubbornness and every word he'd ever failed to say and had nothing left except the raw animal need to survive. Elena opened the door. The wind tried to come in with Dawson, but she braced against it, and he squeezed through, and she got the door shut and sealed it again. Dawson stood there. Snow fell off him in clumps. His face was red and white in patches. His hands were shaking so badly he couldn't unfasten his coat. Margaret took his coat for him. Elena gave him coffee. He sat by the fire and held the cup with both hands and didn't drink, just held it, feeling the heat through the tin, letting it tell his fingers that they were still alive. "Thank you," he said. "Drink the coffee, Mr. Dawson." He drank. And then he said the thing that had been sitting in him for months. "I should have said something sooner, at the store, to Ridley, to Harlan, to all of them. I should have told them you were right." Elena poured herself a cup and sat down across from him. "It wouldn't have mattered. People don't listen until the storm comes. That's not a flaw, Mr. Dawson. That's just how people are. It's a flaw if it kills them." The dugout went quiet. The fire crackled. The wind screamed outside, muffled to a low moan by 3 feet of solid earth. "How bad is it out there?" Elena asked. Dawson looked at her. His eyes said everything before his mouth caught up. "It's the worst I've ever seen, and it's not stopping." Elena nodded. She looked at Margaret. Margaret looked back. "How many people are in this valley?" Elena asked. 40, maybe 42. "How many of them are in cabins that won't last the night?" Dawson closed his eyes. When he opened them, they were wet. All of them. Elena didn't answer Dawson right away. She stood at the sealed door with her palm flat against it, feeling the vibration of the wind through the timber frame, the only wood in the entire structure, and even that was holding steady, because the earth around it absorbed the shock. She counted heartbeats. 1, 2, 3. Then she turned. "We can't go out there and get them." Dawson started to stand. "We have to—" "Sit down, Mr. Dawson. Listen to me. That wind will kill us in 20 minutes. You barely made it here, and you're a strong man who knew where he was going. If we go stumbling around this valley in the dark trying to find people, we die. And then nobody has shelter. So we just sit here. We sit here until the wind drops, even a lull, even 10 minutes. That's when we move." Margaret pulled her blanket tighter. "And if the wind doesn't drop?" "It will. Storms breathe, Margaret. They come in waves. There'll be a gap, and when it comes we have to be ready." Elena crossed to her shelf and pulled down Carl's notebook. She opened it to a page she hadn't shown anyone, a rough map of the valley Carl had sketched before they'd even filed the claim. Every homestead was marked, every trail, every ridge and creek crossing. "Dawson, which cabins are closest to this slope?" He leaned over the map. His finger was still shaking, but his mind was working now, sharp and fast, the way a man's mind works when purpose replaces panic. "Falk is closest, 1/4 mile northeast just below the tree line. Then the Pruitts maybe 1/2 mile due east, Ridley's the farthest, almost a mile northwest other side of Harlan's Creek. What about Harlan? The store. Harlan lives above the store. Stone foundation, but the upper floor is pine. Same problem as everyone else. Elena ran her finger along the map. If the wind drops, we go to Falk first. He's got children. 3. Youngest is 4. Then Falk first. We get them moving toward this hill. Then the Pruitts. And Ridley. Elena looked up from the map. Something crossed her face. Not anger, not bitterness, but something harder to name. The memory of every word that man had said about her. Every laugh. Every time he'd turned her struggle into entertainment for men who needed someone to look down on. Ridley too, she said. Dawson studied her. You sure? This isn't about who was kind to me, Mr. Dawson. This is about who's going to freeze to death if we don't move. Margaret made a sound, half laugh, half sob. Carl would have said the same thing. Carl did say the same thing. Every day of his life. They waited. Elena fed the fire, small, careful conserving. She heated beans and cornmeal, and they ate in silence, listening to the storm rage above them, like a living thing trying to claw its way through the hill. The sound should have been terrifying. Instead, muffled by earth and stone, it was almost tolerable, almost distant, as if the storm existed in a different world separated from theirs by 3 feet of clay that had been there for 10,000 years and would be there for 10,000 more. At 4:30, Elena felt it. The pressure changed. The candle flame which had been bending steadily toward the shaft straightened. She held up her hand. Listen. Dawson and Margaret went still. For a moment, they heard nothing different, just wind constant grinding. But then it shifted. The pitch dropped. The force against the door eased slightly, and Elena's oiled canvas seal stopped fluttering. Now, Elena said. It won't last long. She was already at the door. She grabbed her heaviest coat, wrapped a scarf around her face, and pulled on gloves she'd lined with rabbit fur. Dawson was right behind her. Margaret, keep the fire going. Keep the door ready to open fast when we come back. How will I know it's you? 3 knocks. Pause. 2 more. Elena pulled the door open. The cold hit her like a wall of water. She gasped, recovered, and pushed out into it. Dawson followed. Margaret sealed the door behind them and pressed her back against it and prayed to a god she wasn't sure she believed in anymore. The lull was thin. The wind had dropped from murderous to merely brutal. Elena could see maybe 15 feet, enough to follow the slope down and northeast toward Falk's place. She moved fast, leaning into the wind, feeling the ground with her boots because her eyes were useless. Dawson stayed close, one hand on her shoulder so they wouldn't separate. They almost missed Falk's cabin. Elena walked past it by 10 feet before Dawson grabbed her arm and pointed. The cabin was half buried in a drift. The roof was sagging in the center, not collapsed but close. 1 more hour, maybe 2, and it would go. Elena pounded on the door. Falk, Henry Falk. Nothing. She pounded again. Then she heard it, a child crying. Thin and high and muffled, the sound of a child who'd been crying so long, the crying had become automatic, just the body's way of saying it was still alive. The door opened a crack. Sarah Falk's face appeared raw red, terrified. Mrs. Falk, get your children. Get coats. Get whatever food you can carry. You're coming with us. Where? Up the hill. My house. It's warm and it's safe, and your roof is about to come down. Sarah looked back and sighed. Then she looked at Elena. Henry won't leave. He says, I don't care what Henry says. Get your children. Something in Elena's voice broke through the fog of cold and fear and wifely obedience that had kept Sarah Falk paralyzed for hours. She turned. She grabbed coats. She grabbed children, yanking them up, stuffing arms into sleeves with a speed that came from somewhere deeper than thought. Henry appeared behind her. He was holding a hammer, as if a hammer could fix a roof that was being crushed by 4 feet of snow. What the hell is going on? Mr. Falk, your roof has maybe 2 hours. Probably less. I have shelter that will hold. You need to come now. I'm not leaving my cabin. Dawson stepped forward. Henry, look up. Falk looked up. The center beam of his roof was bowing, not just sagging, but actively bending the wood fibers, separating under a weight they were never designed to carry. As he watched, a crack appeared along the grain. Small, but growing. He looked at the hammer in his hand. He looked at the crack. And the fight went out of him, the way air goes out of a punctured bellows, fast, total, and with a sound that was almost sad. "Get the flour," he told Sarah. They moved. 6 of them now: Elena, Dawson, Henry, Sarah, and 2 of the 3 Falk children. The eldest, a boy of 12 named Peter, carried the youngest on his back because the snow was too deep for a 4-year-old to walk. Sarah clutched a sack of flour in one arm and her middle child's hand in the other. Henry carried nothing. His hands hung at his sides, and he walked like a man attending his own funeral. The wind was building again. The lull was closing. Elena felt it in the way the gust came faster, harder, with less space between them. They had minutes. "Move faster!" she shouted over the wind. They couldn't hear her. She grabbed Peter's arm. The boy stumbled, but kept his balance, kept his sister on his back, and pulled him forward, pointing up the slope. The boy understood. He put his head down and climbed. They made it to the dugout with maybe 3 minutes to spare before the full force returned. Margaret heard the knocks, 3, pause 2, and hauled the door open. Bodies poured through. Elena came last, slamming the door shut and sealing it before the wind could follow them in. Sarah Falk sank to the floor with her children around her and wept. Not from sadness, from the sudden, shocking absence of cold. The dugout wrapped around her like hands cupping a flame, and the warmth, the steady, impossible warmth that radiated from the walls themselves, undid every hour of terror she'd endured. Henry stood in the center of the space and turned slowly, looking at the arched ceiling, the smooth walls, the small fire that was somehow heating the entire room. He reached out and touched the wall. His hand stayed there. "How is it warm?" "The earth stores heat," Elena said, "and the arch distributes weight, and the walls don't leak because there are no gaps. There's nothing for the wind to find." Falk pulled his hand away from the wall. He stared at it as if it had betrayed him. "I spent 6 months building my cabin." "I know. And it's going to collapse." "Probably." He sat down, hard, like his legs had decided the conversation was over, even if his mouth hadn't. His 12-year-old son Peter watched him, and something shifted in the boy's face. Not disappointment, not anger, but the first crack in the wall every child builds around the belief that their father knows everything. Elena gave them water. She heated food. She moved through the space efficiently, making room, organizing bodies, directing people the way a general directs troops, not with force, but with certainty. She knew where everything was. She knew how much she had. She knew how long it would last. Dawson watched her and thought. She planned for this. Not hoped, not prayed. Planned. 30 minutes passed. The storm raged. And then the knocking came again. Not 3 pause 2, just knocking. Wild, desperate, arrhythmic. Elena went to the door. "Who's there? Please." A woman's voice. High cracking. "Please, for the love of God." Elena opened the door. Mary Pruitt fell through it, literally, fell. Her knees gave out on the threshold, and she collapsed onto the stone floor with snow in her hair and ice on her eyelashes, and 3 boys behind her ranging from 8 to 15. All of them shaking so hard they couldn't speak. Samuel was not with them. Elena sealed the door. Margaret wrapped blankets around the boys. Sarah Falk, who 5 minutes ago had been weeping on this same floor, pulled the youngest Pruitt boy into her arms without hesitation, because that's what women did. They suffered, and then they turned around and helped someone else suffer less. "Mary, where's Samuel?" Mary was on her knees. Her lips were blue. She tried to speak, and what came out was more breath than words. "Roof came down. Samuel. He pushed us out. The beam. It caught his leg." The dugout went silent. Every person in it understood what that meant. Samuel Pruitt was trapped in a collapsed cabin in a blizzard with a beam on his leg and no one to pull it off. Elena looked at Dawson. Dawson looked at Elena. "No, Margaret said. "You can't. You'll die out there." "He'll die if we don't," Dawson said. He was already reaching for his coat. "Mr. Dawson, you're exhausted. You've been out twice already." "Then come with me." Elena didn't hesitate. Not for a second. She pulled on her coat, grabbed a length of rope from her shelf, and turned to Margaret. "Keep them warm. Keep the fire small. Don't waste wood." "Elena." 3 knocks. Pause. 2. "Don't open it for anything else." They went out. Into the teeth of it. Into the full screaming fury of a storm that had already broken every cabin in the valley and was now working on the people themselves. Mary had told them enough. The Pruitt cabin was half a mile east. The roof had come down on the north side. Samuel had shoved his family out through the south window, the only opening still clear, and stayed behind because the beam had his right leg pinned from the knee down. Half a mile. In this wind. In this cold. In darkness so complete that Elena couldn't see her own hands. She tied the rope around her waist and gave the other end to Dawson. 10 feet of line between them. If one fell, the other would feel the pull. If one stopped, the other would know. They walked into nothing. The cold was beyond cold. It had crossed into something else, a physical presence, a weight, a force that pressed against every inch of exposed skin and tried to shut the body down organ by organ. Elena's lungs burned. Her eyes streamed tears that froze on her cheeks. Her fingers, even inside the rabbit fur gloves, began to go numb. She counted steps. She'd counted them on the way to Falk's, and she'd noted the angle, the slope, the way the ground dipped at the creek crossing. She adjusted for the Pruitt's direction, more east, less north. She moved by feel and calculation, and the kind of desperate faith that lives somewhere below thought. 200 steps, 300. The rope tugged. Dawson had stumbled. She stopped, pulled, felt him recover. They kept going. 400 steps, 500. Elena's count said they should be close. She stopped and listened. The wind filled everything but underneath it. Barely there, she heard something. A voice. Male. Weak. "Here!" she screamed. The wind stole it. She screamed again. "Samuel!" "Here!" Faint. Barely a word at all. She followed the sound. 20 more steps. 15. 10. Her foot hit something solid, a log. A cabin log. She reached down and felt the wall, or what had been the wall. It was partially collapsed, leaning inward at an angle that meant the roof was down. "Samuel, can you hear me?" "Leg, I can't." Elena found the gap. Mary had gotten the children out through a window on the south side, and the window was still open, a rectangle of blackness in the ruined wall. She crawled through. Dawson followed, pulling the rope in behind him. Inside was chaos. The roof beam, a log as thick as a man's thigh, lay diagonally across the cabin. Under it, wedged between the beam and the floor, was Samuel Pruitt's right leg. He was conscious. Barely. His face was gray, and his breathing was shallow, and his eyes had the unfocused look of a man whose body was already starting to leave. "We're going to lift this beam," Elena said. "Mr. Dawson, take that end." "I can't feel my hands." "You don't need to feel them. You need to use them." They positioned themselves on either side of the beam. Elena braced her feet against the floor. Dawson did the same. On 3, 1, 2, 3. They lifted. The beam didn't move. It was too heavy, waterlogged pine 12 feet long, carrying the weight of collapsed roofing. "Again," Elena said. "Harder." "Elena, I can't." Again. They lifted. Elena felt something in her back, give a muscle, a tendon, something that tore and sent white fire up her spine. She didn't let go. She pushed through it, screaming through her teeth, and the beam shifted. 1 inch, 2, 3. "Samuel, pull your leg out, now." He tried. The pain made him scream, a sound so raw and animal that Dawson almost dropped his end. But Samuel pulled. He dragged himself backward on his elbows, his useless leg trailing. And when it cleared the beam, Elena and Dawson let go, and the log slammed back down with a sound like a gunshot. Samuel's leg was broken. Obviously badly broken, the shin was wrong, angled in a way that made Dawson look away and Elena look closer. She'd seen Carl's injuries. She'd seen what cold and damage did to a body. She knew they had maybe 30 minutes to get this man to warmth, or the leg wouldn't matter because the rest of him would be gone. "Can you stand?" "No." "Then we carry you." Dawson stared at her. "Carry him, half a mile, in this." "Would you like the alternative, Mr. Dawson?" He didn't answer. He got on one side of Samuel. Elena got on the other. They lifted him between them, 200 pounds of broken man suspended between a widow who weighed 120 soaking wet, and a farmer who'd already been out in the storm 3 times that night. They went back through the window, into the wind, into the dark, into the half-mile that might as well have been 100. Elena stopped counting steps. She stopped thinking. She stopped feeling the pain in her back, and the numbness in her hands and the fire in her lungs. She reduced herself to one function forward. One foot, then the other. Hold the weight. Keep the direction. Don't stop. Don't think about stopping. Don't think at all. Dawson was failing. She could feel it in the way his side of Samuel kept dipping, the way his steps shortened, the way his breathing turned from ragged to desperate. He was running out. His body was telling him to stop, and he was fighting it with everything he had, but the body always wins. The body always wins in the end. "Talk to me, Mr. Dawson." "What?" "Talk. Tell me something. Anything." "I can't." "Tell me why you left Ohio." A pause, a gasp. Then, "My brother, he got the farm, all of it. Our father left it all to him because I told the old man he was wrong about something. Can't even remember what now." "So you came west." "I came west because I was too proud to beg and too stubborn to stay." "Keep walking." "I should have stayed. I should have begged." "No. You should have done exactly what you did. Keep walking." They walked, and somehow, through cold and dark and wind and the weight of a broken man between them, they walked all the way back to the hill. Elena found the slope by feel. She found the door by memory. She knocked. 3. Pause. 2. Margaret opened the door, and the 3 of them fell inside, and the door slammed shut, and the world outside ceased to exist. Samuel Pruitt lay on Elena's stone floor with his broken leg at an angle that made his sons cry and his wife bury her face in her hands. 11 people now in a space built for one. 11 people breathing the same air, sharing the same warmth, alive because a woman they'd ignored had built something they'd mocked. Elena knelt beside Samuel. She looked at his leg. She looked at Dawson, who had collapsed against the wall and was staring at the ceiling with the blank, exhausted face of a man who had given every last thing he had. She looked at Margaret. And Margaret saw something in Elena's eyes that she had never seen before. Not determination, not anger, not the careful planning that had defined everything Elena did. Fear, because the storm wasn't stopping. And there were still people out there. And she knew with the certainty of physics and earth and 3 feet of clay that her shelter would hold. But she also knew that holding wasn't the same as saving. Not yet. Not with Ridley and Harlan and God knew who else still out there in cabins that were already dead, built by men who had been so certain they were right that they'd bet their families' lives on it. Elena wrapped Samuel's leg with strips of canvas and 2 straight sticks from her firewood pile. She worked fast and clean, the way a woman works when she's done it before, because she'd wrapped Carl's frostbitten hands the same way, the same careful pressure, the same knots. It hadn't saved Carl. But she was older now, and she knew more, and she would not lose another person to a winter that could have been survived if someone had just been willing to build differently. She finished the splint. She stood up. She put her hand against the wall of her dugout, the wall she had carved with bleeding hands alone for 7 months, and felt the warmth radiating back at her. "How many more?" she asked, and her voice was steady, and everyone in that room heard it, and understood that this woman, this widow, this person they had dismissed and mocked and pitied, was the only reason any of them were still breathing. Dawson lifted his head from the wall. He met her eyes, and what passed between them was not romance, not attraction, not anything so simple. It was recognition. the recognition of one exhausted human being looking at another and understanding finally completely what courage actually looked like. "Ridley's still out there," he said. "Harlan, too." Elena pulled her coat back on. Her back screamed. Her hands were raw. She'd been awake for 22 hours, and she'd carried a broken man through a blizzard, and she hadn't eaten since the beans 6 hours ago. She pulled her gloves on and walked to the door. Margaret caught her arm before she reached the door. "You can't go again." "Let go, Margaret. Your back is injured. You've been out twice. You're shaking, and you don't even know it." Elena looked down at her own hands. Margaret was right. They were trembling not from cold, not from fear, but from the deep muscular exhaustion that comes when the body has been pushed past what it was built to do. She hadn't noticed. "I'm going." "Then I'm coming with you." "No. Someone has to stay here. Someone has to keep these people calm and keep the fire going and make sure Samuel doesn't move that leg." "Elena, Margaret, please." The older woman's grip loosened. Her face twisted with something between fury and grief, the look of a woman who understood that arguing was useless and that understanding made her want to scream. Dawson pushed himself off the wall. Every joint in his body protested. His knees popped, his shoulders burned. His lungs still felt scorched from the cold. "I'll go." "Mr. Dawson, you can barely stand." "I can stand fine." He couldn't. He was leaning against the wall for balance, and everyone in the room knew it. But he straightened up and pulled his coat on and looked at Elena with eyes that said, "Don't fight me on this." She didn't. They went out together. Into the storm. Into the dark. The third time for Dawson. The third time for Elena. And the storm, as if offended by their persistence, had gotten worse. The wind had shifted. It was coming from the north now, straight over the granite ridge, and it carried a cold so absolute that Elena's first breath outside felt like swallowing broken glass. She doubled over, coughing. Dawson grabbed her arm and held her up. "Harlan's first," she gasped. "He's closer." They moved northeast, angling down the slope toward the creek. Harlan's store sat on the only flat piece of ground in the valley, a natural shelf above the floodplain where George Harlan had planted himself 3 years ago and declared it the center of civilization. The stone foundation was solid. The upper floor was not. They found the store by collision. Elena walked straight into the east wall, and the impact knocked the air out of her. She felt along the stone until she found the door. She pounded. "Harlan, George! Harlan!" The door opened so fast, she almost fell inside. Harlan pulled her through. Dawson stumbled in behind her. The door slammed. George Harlan was 61 years old and had survived more than most men could catalog. Indian Wars. A cholera outbreak in St. Louis. 2 wives buried before their time. He was not a man who frightened easily, but he was frightened now. "The upstairs is done," he said. No greeting, no preamble, just the fact. "The roof split an hour ago. I've been down here in the store, but the wind is coming through the floorboards. I can't keep the stove lit." His wife Martha sat behind the counter, wrapped in horse blankets, her face calm, in the way that very old, very tough women go calm when things get bad, not because they aren't afraid, but because fear has become inefficient. "We have shelter," Elena said, "up on the south slope." "Your dugout." "Yes." Harlan looked at her. In that look was the entire history of everything he'd said and thought about her for the past 9 months. The jokes, the dismissals, the certainty that she was wrong because she was different, and different meant wrong. "George," Martha said from behind the counter, "don't be a fool." Harlan's jaw tightened. His pride was fighting his survival instinct, and for a terrible moment Elena thought pride might win. She'd seen it happen. She'd seen men choose death over admission. "Bring what food you have," Elena said. "Flour, salt, dried meat, whatever you can carry. We have 13 people up there, and we're going to need supplies." She said it that way on purpose, not as a plea, not as a rescue, but as a logistics problem. She gave him a role, a contribution, something that turned him from a man being saved into a man helping save. It was the only language his pride would accept. It worked. "Martha, get the flour. the salt pork too, and the molasses grabbed the tin. Martha was already moving. She'd been ready for an hour, waiting for her husband to catch up to what she'd already decided. They loaded what they could carry. Harlan took the heaviest sack, 40 pounds of flour, on his shoulder, because of course he did. Martha carried the salt pork and the molasses. Elena and Dawson led them out. The walk back was the worst yet. The wind had hit full gale. Elena couldn't maintain direction. The gusts knocked her sideways, spinning her, disorienting her, until she wasn't sure which way was up the slope and which way was down. She stopped. She knelt. She put her hand flat on the ground and felt for the angle of the hillside. Uphill, left. She corrected and pushed forward. Harlan fell. The flour sack went into the snow and he went down on top of it, and for 3 seconds he didn't move. Dawson hauled him up by the collar, physically lifted him the way you lift a child, and shoved him forward. No words, no encouragement, just force. Because encouragement was a luxury they couldn't afford, and force was all they had left. They made it. Margaret opened the door. 4 more bodies. 13 became 15. The dugout was full now. 15 people in a space 20 feet deep and 10 feet wide. Bodies packed along the walls. Children in laps, the air thick with breath and heat, and the copper smell of blood from Samuel Pruitt's wrapped leg. Elena stood at the door and counted. 15. She ran through the names in her head. The Falks. Henry, Sarah. 3 children. The Pruitts. Mary, 3 boys. Samuel on the floor. Margaret. Dawson. Harlan and Martha. Herself. That left Ridley. Thomas Ridley, his wife Catherine, his son Thomas Jr., and his daughter, the little girl who'd woken up screaming when the crack opened in the wall. 4 people, almost a mile away. In the worst conditions Elena had faced yet. How many does that leave? Margaret asked, though she already knew. 4. The Ridleys. The dugout went quiet. Every person in that room had a history with Thomas Ridley. For most of them, it wasn't a kind history. He'd cheated Harlan on a cattle deal. He'd called Falk lazy to his face at a Sunday gathering. He'd refused to help the Pruitts repair their well the previous summer, saying it wasn't his problem. And he'd made Elena Vogel's life miserable from the day she arrived. Nobody spoke. The silence said everything. Henry Falk broke it. The wind's getting worse. Going out again would be suicide. Might be, Elena said. You've done enough. You've saved all of us. You don't owe Ridley anything. I know I don't. Then why would you? Because his daughter is 6 years old, Henry, and she didn't choose her father. The silence that followed was different. Heavier. The kind of silence that falls when someone says something so simple and so true that it cuts through every argument before it starts. Dawson got to his feet. He didn't speak. He just stood. Elena looked at him. You don't have to. I know. Your hands are frostbitten. 2 more fingers and you'll lose them. I know that too. Then why? Dawson pulled his coat on. He wrapped his damaged hands in strips of blanket that Margaret had torn for him. He looked at Elena, and for the first time since she'd met him, he smiled. It was a small smile, exhausted and cracked, and not entirely sane, but it was real. Because I spent my whole life leaving when things got hard. Ohio. 2 other claims before this one. Every time it hurt I left. I'm tired of leaving. Elena nodded. She pulled her coat on. Margaret didn't try to stop them this time. She just held the door and watched them walk out and closed it behind them and stood with her forehead against the timber and whispered, "Come back." The storm had become something beyond weather. It was a presence, a force with weight and intention pressing down on the valley, with a malice that felt personal. Elena and Dawson bent into it like people walking uphill, except there was no hill, just wind so strong it had mass. They crossed Harlan's Creek by feel. The creek was frozen solid and covered in 3 feet of snow, but Elena found it because the ground dipped and the angle changed, and she'd walked this path enough times to carry it in her bones. Across the creek, up the far bank, northwest. Dawson went down at the 400-step mark. Not a stumble, a collapse. His legs quit. He went to his knees and then to his side, and the snow began covering him immediately greedily, as if the storm had been waiting for this. Elena knelt beside him. She grabbed his coat and pulled. "Get up. I can't feel my legs." "Get up, Mr. Dawson." "Elena, I can't." She slapped him. Open hand across the face hard enough to snap his head sideways. The shock of it, the sheer wrongness of a woman hitting a man in the middle of a blizzard, cut through the fog in his brain. "Get up, or I leave you here and go alone, and if you make me do that, I will never forgive you." He got up. He didn't know how. His legs were numb, and his hands were frozen, and his mind was sliding toward the warm, sweet darkness that hypothermia offers right before it kills you. But he got up because Elena Vogel told him to, and because somewhere in the ruins of his exhaustion, he understood that this woman did not say things she didn't mean. They found Ridley's cabin by the sound, not the wind, not the storm. A different sound, the grinding, groaning, cracking sound of a structure dying. Ridley's cabin, the one he'd been so proud of, was coming apart. The crack in the north wall had spread until the entire wall was compromised. The roof without the wall's support was twisting. The fireplace chimney, those heavy stones Ridley had hauled all summer, was leaning inward. Elena pounded on the door. No answer. She pounded again. The door opened. Thomas Ridley stood in the gap, and Elena barely recognized him. The man who had mocked her, who had stood in Harlan's store and called her crazy, and laughed and made others laugh, that man was gone. In his place was something smaller. Something broken. A man wearing his own failure like a coat he couldn't take off. "Ridley, get your family." He stared at her. His mouth moved, but nothing came out. "Thomas." She used his first name for the first time. "We have shelter. It's warm. It's safe. But we have to go now." "You came for me? I came for your children. You can come too." Something cracked in his face. Not anger. He was past anger. Not pride. Pride was buried under 3 feet of snow, along with everything he thought he knew. What cracked was the last wall he had. The internal one. The one that had kept him upright and certain and superior for 43 years. Catherine pushed past him. She was carrying the little girl 6 years old wrapped in a quilt, not crying anymore. Past crying. Her eyes were open and empty, and she was shaking in a way that children shake when the cold has gone deep enough to become dangerous. "Where?" Catherine said. One word, no hesitation. She didn't care where. She didn't care how. She cared that this woman was standing at her door offering survival, and Catherine Ridley was going to take it. "Follow me. Stay close. Don't stop." Thomas Jr. came next. 14 strong, scared. He had his mother's practicality. He'd already grabbed Blanket's food, his father's good knife. He took his mother's arm to support her, and looked at Elena with eyes that were too old for his face. Ridley came last. He stepped out of his dying cabin and didn't look back. Men who look back at something they've lost tend to stop moving, and some deep instinct told him that stopping was death. The walk back was the longest mile of Elena Vogel's life. She couldn't feel her feet, hadn't been able to feel them for 20 minutes. She walked on memory. Not the memory of the ground, but the memory of Carl. Carl's hands on her wrist. Carl's voice saying, "Build smart." Carl's face the last time she saw it, gray and thin, and dying in a cabin that failed him because everyone around him had built the same way and called it good enough. Good enough killed people. Elena had learned that the day Carl died, and she had spent every day since making sure it would never be true again. Not for her. Not for anyone she could reach. Dawson was a ghost beside her, moving on pure will. His body had left the conversation. His muscles were frozen. His blood was thick. His brain was firing on fumes. But something kept his legs churning. Something kept him upright. Maybe it was Elena's words about not leaving. Maybe it was the 6-year-old girl in Catherine's arms. Maybe it was nothing noble at all, just the dumb animal refusal to lie down that separates the living from the dead. Catherine stumbled at the creek crossing. She went down on one knee, and the girl nearly flew from her arms. Thomas Jr. caught his mother. Ridley caught the girl. For 3 seconds, the 4 of them were tangled in the snow, and the wind was tearing at them, and Elena thought, This is where I lose them. This is where the storm wins. Move! She screamed. Her voice was gone, shredded by cold and wind into something barely human. But they heard her. They moved. Across the creek. Up the bank. Up the slope. Elena found the door by falling against it. Her body hit the timber and she slid down, and her hands found the frame, and she knocked. 3. Pause. 2. Margaret opened the door, and Elena fell through it, and Dawson fell on top of her, and the Ridleys poured in behind them, and Margaret slammed the door and sealed it, and the world inside the hill went still. 15 became 19. 19 people in a space built for one. Bodies everywhere along the walls, on the floor, packed so tight that moving required negotiation. The air was thick and warm and alive with breath and heat and the primal, unmistakable smell of human beings who had survived something that should have killed them. Elena couldn't stand. She lay on the floor where she'd fallen and stared at the arched ceiling she had carved by hand, alone with a broken pickaxe and bleeding fingers and a dead husband's dream. The ceiling was holding. The walls were holding. The earth was holding. The way earth always held, patient, ancient, indifferent to the opinions of men who thought wood and nails were enough. Dawson lay next to her. He couldn't move his hands. His fingers were white and hard, and he knew they both knew that he would lose at least 2 of them. Maybe more. "Mr. Dawson?" "Yeah." "Thank you." He laughed. It sounded like sandpaper on stone, but it was a laugh. "You slapped me." "You needed slapping." "I did." Thomas Ridley sat against the far wall with his daughter in his lap. The girl had stopped shaking. The warmth was reaching her slowly, the way the sun reaches the ground on a winter morning, gradual, steady, unstoppable. Her eyes were closing. She was falling asleep. Ridley held her. He held her the way a man holds something precious he almost lost, which is to say, he held her too tight and didn't care. He looked across the crowded room at Elena. She was still on the floor. Her hair was wild with ice. Her coat was soaked. Her back was injured and her hands were raw, and she'd just walked through the worst blizzard the valley had ever seen 4 times to save people who had spent 9 months treating her like a joke. "Why?" he said. Elena turned her head to look at him. "Why did you come for us?" She could have said something righteous. She could have said something forgiving. She could have delivered the kind of speech that wraps everything up in a neat moral lesson and makes the audience feel warm. She didn't. She said the truth. "Because I know what it feels like to be inside something that's failing and have nowhere else to go. I know what it feels like to watch someone you love die because the walls weren't good enough and nobody had anything better to offer. I built this place so that would never happen again. To anyone, including you." Ridley's eyes filled. He didn't wipe them. He didn't look away. He sat there with tears running down his face and his daughter sleeping in his arms, and he let every person in that room see him break because he had nothing left to hide behind. "I'm sorry," he said, "for what I said, for what I did, for all of it." Elena closed her eyes. "I know." Margaret knelt beside Elena and lifted her head and put a folded blanket under it. She brought water. She brought a piece of dried meat. She said nothing because Margaret understood that sometimes the most loving thing you could do for a person was let them rest without requiring them to feel anything about it. 19 people. 1 fire. 3 feet of earth between them and a storm that would not stop for 2 more days. Enough food if they rationed. Enough warmth if they kept the fire small and let the walls do the work. Elena lay on the floor of the house she'd built into the hill. The house they'd called a grave, a burrow, a monument to madness, and she listened to 19 people breathe. Children sleeping. Women murmuring. Men quiet with the particular quiet of men who have been proven wrong and are trying to figure out how to live with it. And underneath all of it, steady and constant and unshakable, the heartbeat of the earth itself. Holding them, keeping them, doing what it had always done for anyone who was willing to listen. Elena's hand found the wall beside her. She pressed her palm flat against the warm clay. She kept it there until she fell asleep. Her fingers spread against the skin of the hill, feeling the pulse of something older than pride and stronger than fear. Dawson watched her sleep. Then he closed his own eyes. His last thought before the dark took him was simple and clear and final. She was never crazy. She was the only one paying attention. The second day was harder than the first. Not because of the cold, the dugout held its temperature the way Elena knew it would. The walls radiating steady warmth regardless of what raged above. Not because of the wind, they couldn't even hear it anymore, just a low, distant hum that had become background noise like a heartbeat. You stopped noticing. The second day was harder because of the people. 19 bodies in a 20 by 10 space meant that every breath was shared, every movement was negotiated. Every private misery became public. Samuel Pruitt's leg had swollen overnight, the skin tight and purple around the makeshift splint. And he'd started groaning in his sleep. Low animal sounds that woke the Falk children every hour. The youngest, the 4-year-old girl, had started whimpering for home, and Sarah Falk couldn't explain to her that home didn't exist anymore, because explaining it meant accepting it. Henry Falk sat in the corner and stared at the wall and said nothing to anyone. He'd gone somewhere inside himself, a place where men go when shame becomes too large to carry and too heavy to put down. His 12-year-old Peter watched his father disappear into that silence and tried 3 times to talk to him. "Pa, you want water?" "Nothing." "Pa, the little one's asking for you." "Nothing." "Pa?" Nothing. Peter stopped trying. He moved to his mother's side and took over holding the youngest and feeding the middle child pieces of dried beef torn small enough for a 6-year-old to chew. He did it without being asked, without complaint, without the slightest hesitation, and Elena watched him and thought, that boy is 12 years old, and he's already more of a man than half the adults in this room. By noon of the second day, the food situation was getting real. Elena had stored enough for herself for 8 weeks. With Harlan's flour and salt pork and the odds and ends the families had grabbed, she calculated they had enough for 19 people for 5 days. Maybe 6 if they cut portions. She did the math quietly in her head, sitting against the wall with Carl's notebook open in her lap. She didn't share the numbers. Not yet. Numbers spoken aloud become fears, and fears in a closed space become contagion. Margaret knew, though. Margaret always knew. "How long?" she asked low enough that only Elena could hear. 5 days if we're careful." "And the storm?" "I don't know." "You always know." "Not this time. This storm isn't following rules I understand." Margaret absorbed that. She looked across the room at the 19 faces, tired, scared, trusting. Trusting Elena. Every one of them had placed their survival in the hands of a woman they'd dismissed 9 months ago, and the weight of that trust was something Elena carried in her chest like a stone. "We'll make it work," Margaret said. "We will." Elena organized. She couldn't help it. It was how her mind worked, how Carl's mind had worked, how they'd built their marriage on the shared belief that problems were just puzzles with edges you hadn't found yet. She divided the food into portions. She assigned water duty 2 people at a time to fill containers from the small seepage point she'd discovered in the back wall where groundwater wept through the clay slowly enough to collect, but not enough to flood. She established a rotation for the ventilation shaft cap, opening it wider during the day when they needed more air and closing it at night to hold heat. She assigned a latrine schedule, a bucket in the far corner screened by a hung blanket emptied through a narrow drainage channel she'd originally cut for water runoff. It was miserable and undignified, and it worked. Thomas Jr. Ridley's boy volunteered for every unpleasant task. He emptied the bucket without being asked. He hauled water. He gave his food portion to his little sister twice before Elena caught him and made him eat. "You can't help anyone if you're too weak to stand," she told him. "I'm fine." "You're 14. You're not fine. You're growing, and you need food. Eat." He ate. And he looked at Elena with something that wasn't quite gratitude and wasn't quite worship, but lived somewhere between the two. The look of a boy who was watching a new definition of strength replace the one his father had given him. Ridley himself had barely spoken since his apology the night before. He sat with his daughter and held her and fed her and wiped her face and did all the things a father does, but he moved through it like a man underwater. Catherine handled it. She managed her husband the way she'd always managed him, quietly, efficiently, without needing credit or acknowledgement. She made sure he drank water. She made sure he kept his feet elevated so the frostbite didn't worsen. She did everything except the one thing he actually needed, which was for someone to tell him that being wrong didn't make him worthless. Elena did that. On the evening of the second day, when the room had settled into the uneasy quiet of people trying to sleep in shifts on a stone floor, she sat down next to Ridley. "Your chimney, the stone one. How long did it take you to build?" He looked at her, surprised. 3 months. "You hauled those stones from the creek bed? Every one?" "By hand." "By hand." Elena nodded. "That's hard work, good work." "It didn't save us." "No. But the work itself wasn't wrong, Thomas. The design was wrong. The work was honest." He chewed on that. She could see him turning it over, testing it, looking for the trap. Men like Ridley always looked for the trap because they assumed everyone operated the way they did, with angles, with leverage, with hidden motives. "Why does that matter?" he asked. "Because when this storm ends, and it will end, you're going to have to build again. And I'd rather you build with those same hands, and that same work ethic, and a better design, than have you sit in a corner feeling sorry for yourself while your wife does everything." His jaw tightened. For a moment she thought she'd pushed too far. Then something released in his face. Not a smile, not forgiveness, but the first loosening of a knot that had been tightening for 2 days. "You don't soften things much, do you?" "Carl used to say I had all the diplomacy of a falling tree." Ridley almost laughed. Almost. It came out as a breath through his nose, but it was the closest thing to laughter anyone had heard from him since the storm began. "He was a smart man, your Carl." He was. And he died because the people around him, including himself, only knew one way to build. "I'm not going to let that happen here. Not to you, not to anyone." The third day, the storm began to change. Elena felt it at dawn. The pressure shifted, not dropping this time, but stabilizing. The ventilation shaft stopped pulling draft. The low hum of wind outside softened by a degree that only she would notice, because she'd been listening to this storm the way a doctor listens to a heartbeat, tracking every variation, every rhythm, every pause. "It's easing," she said. Dawson raised his head. His hands were wrapped in fresh bandages. Margaret had redressed them that morning, and the news was bad. 3 fingers on his left hand were black. He'd lose them. He knew it. He'd accepted it with the particular calm of a man who understood that fingers were a small price for breathing. "You sure?" "Pressure's leveling, winds shifting east. It's not over, but the back is broken." Harlan, who'd been sitting by the fire feeding it small pieces of wood, with the measured precision of a man who understood rationing, looked up. "How long until we can go out?" "Maybe tonight, maybe tomorrow morning. I want to wait until the wind drops below what I can lean into." And then what? That was the question. The question that everyone in the room had been avoiding, because answering it meant facing what waited outside. Cabins destroyed. Livestock dead. Food stores buried or ruined. 9 months of work, fencing, plowing, planting, building, erased in 3 days. Elena looked at the 19 faces watching her. Children, women, men who'd been broken and humbled and stripped of every certainty they'd carried into this valley. They were waiting for her to tell them what came next, and the responsibility of that, the sheer crushing weight of being the person everyone turns to, settled on her shoulders like a physical load. She wanted to put it down. For one moment, one breath, she wanted to be the widow again. The newcomer. The crazy woman on the hill who only had to worry about herself. But Carl's voice was in her head. It was always in her head. Build smart, not like everyone else. He hadn't just been talking about houses. "When the storm clears," Elena said, "we assess damage. We find out what's standing and what's not. We salvage what we can, and then we rebuild." "Rebuild what?" Falk said from his corner, his first words in a day and a half. "My cabin's gone. Pruitt's cabin's gone. Even Ridley's. We don't rebuild the same way." Silence. "We build into the hills. The way this place is built. Earth shelters with arched ceilings and ventilation shafts and drainage trenches. Not one. Several. Spaced along the south slope where the sun hits, and the granite blocks the north wind. You want us all to live underground. Falk's voice carried the ghost of his old skepticism, but it was thin now, threadbare, a reflex without conviction. I want you to live, Henry. The method is negotiable. The result is not. Peter Falk spoke up. 12 years old, holding his sleeping sister, his voice steady in a way that made every adult in the room uncomfortable. I'll help dig. His father looked at him. Something moved across Henry Falk's face. Shame, pride. Grief, love, all of it at once. Too much for one expression, so his face just crumpled, and he reached out and put his hand on his son's head and held it there. So will I, Henry said. So will I, Dawson said, raising his bandaged hands. Whatever I've got left, I'll use. Martha Harlan, who'd spoken maybe 10 words in 3 days, cleared her throat. I can cook for a work crew. I've done it before on a railroad gang in Kansas. 30 men 3 times a day. I can cut timber, Thomas Jr. said. For the door frames. Pa showed me how. Everyone looked at Ridley. He sat with his daughter asleep in his lap, and he understood what they were waiting for. Not his permission. Not his approval. His participation. They were offering him a chance to be part of something instead of standing outside it, and the offer was genuine because Elena had made it genuine. He looked at Elena. She looked back. No judgment. No triumph. Just the steady, patient gaze of a woman who understood that people changed slowly and that the first step was always the hardest. I can haul stone, Ridley said. I've done it before. I know you have. The storm broke on the morning of the 4th day. Elena opened the door at sunrise, and the world was white and silent and still. The wind was gone. The sky was pale blue, scrubbed clean, emptied out, exhausted by its own fury. The valley was buried. Snow covered everything. Fences, paths, the ruins of cabins that stuck up through the drifts like broken teeth. One by one they came out. 19 people blinking in the sudden light-breathing air that was cold but calm. Children who'd been underground for 3 days stared at the sky as if they'd forgotten it existed. Mary Pruitt wept. Samuel carried out on a makeshift stretcher by Dawson and Thomas. Junior looked at the valley and closed his eyes and whispered something no one could hear. His boys stood around him with their hands at their sides and their faces old beyond their years. Sarah Falk held her children and counted them 1, 2, 3, the way mothers count reflexively, constantly, the arithmetic of love. Catherine Ridley set her daughter down in the snow, and the girl took 2 steps and stopped and looked back at the dark opening in the hillside, the place that had been warm and safe and steady, and said, "Can we go back inside?" Catherine knelt beside her. "We'll build a new one, sweetheart, just like it." "Promise?" "Promise." Elena stood at the entrance of her dugout and watched them. All of them. The people who had mocked her, and the people who had ignored her, and the people who had quietly believed her, and the one man who had walked through a blizzard 4 times beside her. She watched them look at the ruins of the lives they'd built, the conventional lives, the traditional lives, the lives built on the certainty that the old ways were the right ways because they were the old ways. Those lives were gone. Buried under snow that would take weeks to melt. And standing in the wreckage, blinking and broken and alive, they all understood the same thing. At the same time, they were alive, because one woman had refused to build the way she was told. Dawson came to stand beside her. His bandaged hands hung at his sides. He'd lost 3 fingers. The doctor in Pueblo would confirm it weeks later, would cut them clean and bandage the stumps, and Dawson would look at his diminished hand and say, "Small price." And mean it. "What now?" he asked. "Now we dig." They started that afternoon. Falk and his boy Peter marked out a section of the south slope 50 yards from Elena's dugout. Ridley hauled the first stones for a retaining wall, carrying them from the frozen creek, the same way he'd carried stones for his chimney by hand, one at a time, with the dogged persistence of a man trying to rebuild something larger than a wall. Thomas Jr. cut timber for framing. Harlan organized supplies because organizing was what George Harlan did, and people needed to do what they did. Elena supervised. She walked the slope and tested the soil in calculated angles and drew diagrams in the snow with a stick explaining to anyone who'd listen, and now they all listened how an arch worked, how drainage prevented flooding, how the Earth's thermal mass kept interior temperatures stable through the worst cold. She taught them. That was the part that mattered most. Not the buildings were temporary buildings, could be destroyed. Buildings were just arrangements of material that time and weather would eventually reclaim. What mattered was the knowledge, the understanding, the willingness to look at a problem and see it for what it was instead of what tradition said it should be. Margaret worked beside her every day. The older woman never asked for credit, never asked for recognition. She just showed up at dawn and dug until dusk and went to sleep and did it again because Margaret Sutter understood something that most people never learn, that the truest form of belief is labor, and the truest form of loyalty is presence. By February 3, new earth shelters lined the south slope. By March, there were 5. By the time the snow melted and the valley came back to life, green and muddy and smelling of new grass, the settlement had transformed. Not completely, not overnight, but fundamentally in the way that things change when a community decides together that survival matters more than pride. Samuel Pruitt walked again by April. Not well, not without a limp that would stay with him for the rest of his life. But he walked, and his boys walked beside him, and when he stood at the entrance of the new shelter his family had helped build, he put his hand on the earthen wall the same way Elena always did. Palm-flat fingers spread and felt the warmth coming back at him. "It holds," he said. "It holds," Elena said. They didn't need to say more. Years later, when the valley had grown and the earth shelters had multiplied, and travelers passing through stopped to stare at the strange community built into the hillside, people would ask how it started. The story got told different ways by different people. Harlan told it as a tale of community coming together. Margaret told it as a story about a woman who kept her promise. Dawson, when he told it at all, kept it short. She was right. We were wrong. That's the whole thing. Ridley never told it. Not because he was ashamed he'd moved past shame into something more honest, more durable. He didn't tell it because he didn't have to. He showed it. His earth shelter was the largest in the valley by 1860. He'd hauled more stone than anyone. He'd dug deeper, built, stronger, worked harder not to compete, but to make up for something he could never fully repay. His daughter grew up playing in the hillside. She called it home the way children call things home, without question, without history, without knowing that the walls around her existed because her father had been wrong and a widow had been right, and the distance between those two facts had almost killed everyone she loved. Elena never married again. She didn't need to. She had the valley. She had the work. She had Margaret's friendship and Dawson's quiet respect and the knowledge that Carl's dream build smart, not like everyone else, had outlived him in the most concrete way possible. It had kept people alive. On winter nights when the wind picked up and the temperature dropped and the old familiar sounds of a Colorado storm began building. Outside, Elena would sit in her dugout with her hand against the wall and feel the earth's warmth and think about the man who'd seen this before she had. Who'd known, lying in a failing cabin with his lungs full of fluid and his body shutting down, that the answer wasn't more wood or thicker walls or bigger fires. The answer was the ground itself. The patient, ancient, generous ground that held heat the way it held seeds, quietly, faithfully, without asking for anything in return. She'd kept her promise. She'd built smart. And in building smart, she'd done something Carl never imagined. She'd taught an entire valley to do the same. The shelters still stood decades later, long after the wooden cabins of that era had rotted and collapsed and returned to the earth that Elena Vogel had trusted from the beginning. And if you asked anyone in that valley why they built the way they did into the hills with arched ceilings and ventilation shafts and walls of living earth, they'd tell you the same thing. Because a woman showed us that the ground beneath our feet was never the enemy. It was the answer. And all we had to do was listen.